Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine It podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Chris Rademacher, who is the clinical professor, swine veterinarian, and associate director of the Iowa Pork Industry Center at Iowa State University. How are you today, Chris?
I'm great, Laura. Thank you very much. I really appreciate being able to be on with you today.
I'm glad to have you here today, Chris. For some of our audience, they may not be familiar with you, so would you mind giving them a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah. So I was born and raised in southwestern Minnesota. I attended undergraduate college at the University of Minnesota, and then I entered the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine in 1994. And I was entering just at the time that a neighbor of mine was leaving. His name was Brad Frecking. So Brad was graduating from veterinary school, and he was leaving to start a company called New Fashion Pork. So I really had the really fortunate opportunity to spend my 4 years going to school there, up there at the U, and then kind of watching Brad grow New Fashion Pork. And then when I graduated in 1998, he provided me with the opportunity, as he was really busy growing that company, to really come back home and work for him as a veterinarian. But at that time, we were a pretty small company. We really had just 1,000 sows, and we're buying wean pigs and feeder pigs on the open market. And any of you that were around in 1998 kind of remember what happened in 1998. You know, the hog market went through a major correction cycle, which actually provided a unique opportunity for Brad to expand his operation. So, but at that time I was a veterinarian, but I was also a territory or a service manager too. So I was calling on contract growers and all that, which was actually a fantastic opportunity for me. I think I learned more the first 6 months out of veterinary school than I learned the whole 20 years before that. You know, when they say the old adage about drinking out of a fire hose, that's really what I was doing. But I really was learning so much, you know, not just about veterinary medicine, but about practical pig production and relationships with contract growers and with employees, and really learning how to influence people and trying to help them solve problems and get them to do what you're kind of wanting them to do. So really had a fantastic opportunity to spend time with Brad, and as he really grew that business kind of in that night through the late 90s and early 2000s. So I spent 11 years there as the director of veterinary services. And then we were fortunate enough to hire Dr. 𝗪𝗵𝘁 on, and I knew at that point it was my time. I was going to be supplanted. Anybody who knows Dr. 𝗪𝗁 knows that she's extremely bright and extremely talented. So at that point, I had a unique opportunity, as Dr. Roger Main had left Murphy Brown, which was the live production arm for Smithfield Foods, the Western operations, which was based out of Ames. He left a position on the management team, which was the director of production improvement. He left that to come and become the director of operations for Iowa State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. So I had the opportunity to backfill that position, which was tough because that was obviously New Fashion was where I was born and raised back in that area. So I had a lot of family there, but it really was a unique opportunity for me to kind of grow and push myself. I actually had a friend and colleague of mine that came to visit me about a year before I left and looked at me and said, "You're too comfortable." And I said, "Wow, what are you talking about?" And this is really something I think for anybody in your chosen profession. It's kind of like, if you're not stretching yourself, you really need to ask yourself, should I really be that comfortable? Or if my goal is, lifelong learning and continuous improvement, should I be doing something else? And I kind of thought it was actually Dr. Barry Wiseman, who works for Triumph Foods now. And at first I thought he was crazy, but lo and behold, about a year later, I had a new position, and once again found myself drinking from the fire hose, working for the Western operation. So that position was really unique because it provided the opportunity to work with a team of 11 veterinarians that worked in 10 different states, about 350,000 sows. So I worked with a team of veterinarians, which was really unique, but also had the chance to work with the research team, both within the Eastern and Western operations at that point. So that was something that really interested me as a production veterinarian. We really don't get into that classical trial design and research opportunity. So I looked at that was an area of personal interest for me to to try to learn. And obviously we had 3 PhD nutritionists sitting there with Dr. Steve Pullman, who became my boss, and Dr. Bart Borg and Dr. Gary Bradley. So, and then I had another young veterinarian, Dr. Marlon Hoagland, who sat on that team as well. So I had 4 people to really push me, and it really helped challenge me and helped taught me a lot. Again, so I had the opportunity to spend 5 years doing that, and then when the opportunity came to join Iowa State University in December of 2014, then I accepted that position at that time. So I've been with Iowa State, it'll be coming up here about 7.5 years, working at the College of Veterinary Medicine as a clinical professor. But then the other thing I really enjoy about my position, working with the Iowa Pork Industry Center, it was the ability to collaborate across campus, working with the College of Ag and the Ag Econ department and the engineering group, and with yourself, Laura. That's kind of unique. What we have here at Iowa State, I think, is I've had some older faculty members say that doesn't happen, on every college campus. So we have a really tight-knit group, and the Iowa Pork Industry Center really does a nice job of being able to provide those collaborative opportunities. So once again, now I have a bigger pool of people to get to learn from and challenge me and challenge my thought process. So I really appreciate the opportunity and love what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, that's a great history of where you've been, and I think it, especially knowing what you're doing today, I think it tells that story, right? Where your passion comes from and why you're passionate about the things that you're doing today. And certainly knowing your involvement right now is focused on how do we help sow mortality, and how do we help get those young pigs started, and how do we really service that general mortality question, where maybe it's not so much dealing with the PED of the world, but just how do we get pigs in a healthier position so that when diseases do come along, they are better able to handle that. So I think what I want to do is maybe jump over to, let's start with that early weaned, or not early weaned pig, but the weaned pig right after it's weaned. So, what do you see in terms of some of the challenges today in handling that nursery pig?
Yeah, it's really been interesting to kind of watch the evolution of that. As I was kind of getting into vet school, that was in the early to mid 90s. So, at that time, PRRS was just kind of getting to be the mystery swine disease, and there was this whole revolution, at that time about this technology called medicated early weaning. And, we could get rid of mycoplasma and APP if we wean pigs younger, and we could put more pigs through the sow farm, and, and we could, really churn out a lot of pigs in a year. And that was all great, made a lot of sense, but certainly what we learned from that was we can do that, but we didn't really understand the physiology about how to feed that pig and how to really keep a pig that young alive. And I think, PRRS has kind of become the great equalizer among that too, which is to say, boy, we're not sure we can keep a pig like that. We can really do a good job of keeping that pig alive in that post-weaning time period very well with those type of health challenges that we have with that. So, I think that was one of the things that we saw. I know as Dr. Mayne was getting his PhD at Kansas State, and I'll never forget the ASV meeting that I went to. It was one of those things where you sit there and you say, okay, well, he's got this data and it shows when he weans pig older, the mortality goes down. Well, we have these farms that go through PRRS breaks, and after the PRRS breaks, we have a bunch of abortions, and we don't have as many sows, that wean, and we can keep them in the farrowing crates longer. And guess what? Our mortality goes down. So it was kind of interesting to see kind of real world applications of that research. And I think, we've seen, I think as an industry, everybody's kind of moved from that 16, 17 day up to, 21, 22 days. Not everybody, but you've maybe seen the industry average move that way. And in some systems, particularly ones that, battle endemic diseases or in really pig dense areas, they've taken that up to 24 to 26 day wean age, and really have seen some nice mortality reductions from that. Now, certainly that comes as a cost, is, you're not probably going to be able to put out as many pigs from your sow farm as a year, but per year, and your PSY might not look as good, but when 70% of your cost of production is in raising pigs to market, if you're a farrow to finish producer, that's where you've got to make sure that side of that is really profitable. But yeah, we've still got lots of challenges for sure, even with older wean pigs. I do think that is one area of opportunity. Even looking at all the research that gets done out there, there's only a couple things, Laura, that I've seen that have a very linear response. Stocking density being one and wean age being the other, right? The older those pigs get, or the more space we give them, the better they survive and the faster they grow and the more efficient they are with they are converting feed generally as well. So I think that kind of thing helps. But, the other thing we've seen, kind of parallel to that was, moving pigs to wean to finish, even in those, particularly in Smithfield at that time, moving contract growers over, getting them to try to, make 16 to 17 day old pigs work in wean to finish buildings would be tough. But we start putting 24 to 26 day old pigs that are, 12 to 14, 15 pound pigs, that becomes a lot easier proposition, easy for them to care for, and makes it better even for the contract growers in those situations. But I think with that, we may be seeing a little bit less of some of the, strep suis and some of those challenges, but we've probably seen more with rotavirus and E. coli. So just a different profile of diseases. Certainly we've still got things with porcine epidemic diarrhea viruses. So it really is, though, I think, independent of that. And one of the things that, I think our big area of opportunity is we're probably always going to have some sort of disease profile. Just that's the, where we have the kind of pig density that we tend to raise pigs in. So it's really more about what things can we do to manage around that. And it's really got to be just making sure we're spending enough time with those pigs, particularly in that post-weaning period. Some of the best contract growers that I've ever worked with are those guys that, man, they were in those barns literally every 2 hours from the time the sun comes up until that time, the sun goes down. They're in their mat feeding those pigs, getting them up, spending a lot of time up front. But lo and behold, they get those pigs off to a good start 3 to 4 weeks later. They generally have great turns and they're not having to spend a lot of time with them afterwards. And even in some situations where they're somewhat disease challenged, we know that mortalities may go higher, but your best growers, your best caretakers, when you compare them across the board, they're going to generally have the lowest mortality in those situations. So, in many cases, it comes down to those caretakers that just kind of have a sense or a feel for doing a good job of early identifying those at-risk pigs. Now, probably back in my day, 25 years ago, a lot of those guys were guys that maybe started out as independent producers or were guys and gals that were raised on farm, right? So they had some of those inherent animal husbandry skills. So they knew what sort of behaviors to look for when pigs, something's just not right, and they knew they had to intervene quick. I think the Zoetis group has done a really nice job with their individual pig care, and they talk about the A, B, and C pig, identifying those pigs early on and getting them treated. And just seeing that the earlier you identify those at-risk pigs and get them care and treatment, the better outcome that you have. And now the issue that we're having today is our labor gets sourced very differently, and they're not growing up with that kind of background. So we're having to try to train them. And that's probably really an area for some of the technology development, right? We're probably not going to be able to provide that for all our caretakers. So what sort of technology are we able to develop and adapt, for our pig barns that can maybe, with the invention of ear tags and maybe cameras or sensors to be able to say, hey, tell us when that pig, there's something, he's not going to the feeder, or that pig's not going to the water, so that we're making sure we're identifying those pigs early, because it's all about identifying the pigs early. I know one of the studies that we looked at one time was a field study, and we looked at, and it was in a research building where we were getting ready to do a nutrition trial, and the sow farm broke with PRRS 2 weeks before getting ready to fill it. So we had to scrap the research or the nutrition trial, but we took the ability and we wanted to look at just treating pigs, whether we got to them, whether they were an A pig, a B pig, or a C pig. And then we looked at a couple of different antibiotics too, and we treated them. We really enrolled pigs, very aggressively that first week, and then we followed them out to 3 weeks and came back and weighed them and looked at mortality. It was just really interesting, Laura. Those pigs, if they were identified and treated independent of the treatment, if they got treated when they were just an A pig, their mortality was about 6%. If they were a B pig, the mortality was about 9%. But if those pigs didn't receive medication until they were identified as a C pig, those mortality in those pigs were about 30%. So it really just kind of reinforced that thing to say, and that whole group, probably averaged about 10 to 12%. It was what you see when a sow farm breaks with PRRS, right? Those pigs come out PRRS infected, and they're really tough to keep alive. But the difference between catching those pigs earlier and not was just really striking, and it just really reinforced that about independent of whatever disease we're dealing with. The earlier we can catch those pigs and get them the appropriate care and treatment, the better the outcome is going to be. So I think that was really some of the things that we've done with the 5-year grant, the survivability grant, is, we knew we couldn't tackle all diseases. So we're really kind of trying to focus on some of those management things, which is really to say, we've got to do a better job. What things can we do? How can we help producers and caretakers, and really stress that we've got to identify those pigs early on. We can't wait until, those pigs, are too far gone before we're getting them identified and cared and treated.
Mm-hmm. I think you bring up a good point, particularly about our caretakers today not having that inherent background. And it's one that I saw a lot where I was before. We can talk sows as well. So working with the baby pig on the sows and identifying when those pigs were falling behind and needed to be replaced and put on a new sow so that they could get milk. And we'd see the same thing even right after weaning, right? So how do we help those caretakers? Because today that might be an A pig with a little bit of a slab-sided empty belly look, but those pigs could turn in a heartbeat and tomorrow be that B pig already. So you had mentioned technology, but there are any other things that we can do to help people pick that up? Because outside of experience and learning, right, you don't recognize that necessarily. And that was a question I always got was, how did you know that pig needed it today and not tomorrow?
Yeah. And it gets really difficult, right? I mean, the best thing, and I think that's, if you can assign, mentors, and I know there's a lot of territory staff, that go out and they've got lots of barns to cover too. But man, if they can spend time, that was one of the things I think that the individual pig care group team from 𝗂𝗲𝗿𝗁 had put in. They were putting people in, to spend the first 2 weeks with caretakers to kind of train them and help them to, to spot those pigs early on and help them see. Because some of that is, you treat them today and then you got to come back tomorrow and see it, right? And it's tough for that to happen unless you're just in there every day with them and working with them. That's what makes it a little bit difficult. So, just spending a lot of time in there. And I know that's what gets difficult, right? Labor is a valuable commodity, and we try to spread that labor across as many pigs as we can get to, and we're not spending as much time with the pigs as we can. But that it gets to be difficult. But particularly in that post-weaning period, right up front, that's probably the most important time to really be able to do that.
I'm going to flip gears on you just a little bit because you said something earlier that triggered a flag in my head. You were talking about, of course, Roger Main's work and the value of weaning pigs later and later and later. And of course, we recognized during PD that it was more beneficial to wean them earlier rather than later. And interestingly enough, I'm starting to hear rumblings again, particularly with some of these APP flare-ups, as to whether or not we should be considering that. So what is your take on that when we look at the data out there with Roger's information and also then from that health perspective from previous experience? What are you thinking there?
Yeah, it's a fine balance, right? I think in certain situations, I think there's certainly times where, particularly if you're dealing with, if you have a sow herd that is endemically infected with APP, let's say, that's going to be a risk. And I think in some of those situations, that's probably some of the things that that we've seen, right? Is we've gone back to an older wean age, and they probably have more pigs that are positive at weaning, thus more pigs that you have a positive at weaning, generally more likely you are to maybe have an outbreak happen in finishing. So I think there are times, I think as a rule, it probably is something that you want to strive for, but there probably are going to be certain health, situations, like you say, during a PED break, or during a APP, if you're having challenges there, where, weaning that pig earlier is probably going to be a little bit more beneficial. So it's like always, there's probably a little bit of a give and take with that, depending on the pathogen that you're dealing with, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, before we jump off the wean to finish, taking care of newly weaned pigs topic, I want to ask you if you have any tips to people on how to start pigs. I think that's probably, you mentioned it. It seems like once we get the pigs going after the first 3 weeks, they're, if we do it right, we don't have to worry much after that. So what are Dr. Rademacher's tips and tricks for starting pigs?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is you just got to be present. They always say you must be present to win. So I think when you're getting ready to place the building, I do think there's a fair amount of preparation that gets to be very, very important. Things such as making sure the barn's properly heated beforehand. And I know sometimes that can be contentious about, well, in the middle of winter, who's paying the propane bill to heat the slats, right? But there are things about that really are important. Making sure your feeders, your feeders are working properly. There are some basic husbandry things. I think, just talking to some of my colleagues from, who do some ABF production, that they would say it's all about the basics, right? Because we can't use antibiotics to cover up for some of our management mistakes. One of the things that Brad taught me very early on is he said production's all about the details. It's all about the little things. So I think keys are, make sure that barn is set up right, make sure all your feeders are working, make sure all your waters are working, make sure the ventilation's all adjusted, make sure your fans are clean, make sure the floors are preheated, make sure you're setting everything up for that pig to be successful. Make sure your ventilation's set up, make sure your louvers are all set up properly. We had a really neat Excel sheet, to kind of calculate the ventilation so that the person in the barn, they weren't trying to manually calculate. They just had to change the dial every couple of days. They were just changing a couple of settings, right? So whatever we can do to help, make the caretaker successful on that. For me, especially on those wean pigs, it's just about being organized and being set up and just making sure all those little small details are all paid attention to ahead of time. Think through all those things before those first pigs walk through the door.
Mm-hmm. I think those are some excellent points for our listeners. The other piece here, you talked about technology a little bit, both in this question and then previously. And so I'm going to stick on technology, but I'm going to switch to a different part of production. I'm going to talk about PRRS for a little bit. That is, of course, the ever-presence that we deal with in the United States, and people continue to ask, how do we fix this? And I, much like you, were finishing schooling about the time we had the mystery pig disease that just hasn't seemed to have left. So what are your thoughts on where do we go next? What are the next steps in handling PRRS and PRRS management programs?
Yeah, Laura, that was really interesting. They were doing, I'll never forget, I was asked to come over and speak in another country, and they were celebrating 30 years of, PRRS, PRRS solutions and things like that. And my takeaway, I was taken aback from a little bit about, it's kind of like, I'm not sure I'd look at it that way. I'm kind of like, I think it's humbled veterinarians for 30 years is more like it. And really had one of my bosses say, it's humbled some very smart, veterinarians for a very, very long time. And unfortunately, I think what we're seeing here is it's really a study in Darwin's theory of evolution played out over a very short period of time. As I think back to, those early days, Laura, even as as we've learned, and we've learned a lot. And really, PRRS has taught us a ton about, biosecurity and things such as that. So much so as, I would say, although when PED hit, it was certainly devastating. Our ability to clean up farms and get sow farms out of PED, I would say fairly quickly. Well, a lot of that was done because of successes we had in cleaning sow farms up because of PRRS. So PRRS certainly has taught us a lot. But unfortunately, I think this, as we've gotten smarter about our strategies to control it, it has created a situation where we have selected for viruses that have to persist longer and are ones that are, maybe shed in aerosol more than earlier strains. I can think back to, even like the late 90s, early 2000s, we would have PRRS problems, and all we would simply do would be is just to not put gilts in a farm for 6 months, and we'd be usually about by 3 or 4 months, and we'd be testing and we couldn't find PRRS virus anymore, right? It was very, very simple, relatively simple by today's standards, to be able to get PRRS under control in a sow farm. Now these days, you talk to people and they're closing farms for 9 months to a year. And yeah, our surveillance methods have gotten a whole lot better at detecting, very low prevalence, but we're finding, we can still find virus after a year. And in some cases, the producers, they're getting to a point where like, well, we can't close the farm forever. If we're going to eliminate it, we're going to have to, we're going to have to we're going to have to repopulate the herd, because we just can't live with this any longer. So that's kind of, I think, what we're seeing, Laura, is, each new wave, it was kind of the, 2010, 11, 12, it was the 118.2, the 126.2, which I'm not a big fan of RFLP, but that's kind of how people name viruses, right? And then, we kind of got through that wave, and then it was 2015, 16, 17, it was the 174, and that was really devastating, started to cause, a fair amount of sow mortality, which was kind of rare for PRRS viruses. And you hear of lots of abortions in farms not weaning pigs for 8 to 10 weeks. And then now here kind of beginning in, the fall of 2020 and really hitting spring and summer of 2021 was the 144 variant 1C. And, that one, it's like each wave that one was even worse than 174, and so we're just seeing this with each predominant strain that comes out is just so much worse than the one before. We have a very bright virologist at Iowa State named Dr. 𝗂𝗶𝗹𝗃, and he did a really neat kind of quick study. He took a bunch of these 144 viruses, of which this variant 1C, and he took the 174, and then he took some of these older 144 viruses that weren't, maybe were predominant in early 2000s, and he put it into pigs, and then challenged them, and then kind of took took temperatures, weighed them, and then sacrificed them and harvested and looked at their lungs and looked at how much blood virus was in the blood. And it was really interesting because he showed he put a picture of each one of the pens at 6 days post inoculation, and you got the negative controls, and those pigs are all up walking around. You've got 3 of these older strains, and the pigs are all up walking around looking just like the negative control pigs. And then you've got the 2 pens of the 174 and this 144 variant 1C, and those pigs are all skinny, laying there piled, nobody's moving, And then he starts to go through, and they start to pick through them diagnostically after they do after they euthanize and necropsy them. And the older strains, maybe they got like 20 to 30% of the lung is infected with PRRS, and then you get the 174, it's like 85% of the lung, and then the 144 variant 1C, 95% of the lung volume is infected with PRRS. And then they look at how much virus is in the blood, and it's like the variant 1C is like a log higher than 174, which is 1 log of virus higher than the older strain. So it just kind of reinforces this thing that we're just selecting for viruses that are just that much, more virulent than the ones before. And I think it's just gotten to the point now that, we kind of had, we've got these herd closures, and offsite breeding projects and vaccine. And we kind of had some tools that we could utilize, that we could, for lack of better terms, we could somewhat live with, right? Now we're getting to the point where we can't live with them anymore, right? So it's getting bad enough that we're going to need different tools in our toolboxes, so that's kind of the next thing. And I know the vaccine companies, they've looked at a ton of stuff over the 30 years. We've got different, modified live vaccines. That's probably the best is what we've got, but I don't see that, moving forward, we're going to need other tools in our toolboxes. And, we've kind of all got a crash course in the virus with COVID, right? Looking at other options. So, we've got to hope at some point, we got to, are there going to be older antivirals in human medicine that are used for other things, or ones that maybe can be repurposed? Because, one thing, I could see is like, we got to get these newer viruses, that much virus, we got to get that back to maybe where the old, we got to take some of the virus out of the body, right? And are there antivirals that can help with that? There's, some people have been exploring with ivermectin because, hey, that's been used for a lot of viral diseases around the world. It's cheap, readily accessible. And so we need to keep exploring other options and things like that, because that's the unfortunate thing. This virus is evolving much faster than our ability to, produce new tools to be able to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that work. So that's a very good point, and a good challenge to the industry to think about. How do we help minimize that viral load in the pigs, especially if the strains are developing these higher replications of, if you will, of virus within the body. So that's actually a very interesting point. Well, Chris, unfortunately our time is up, but we could talk, I'm sure, for another hour on what's going on in the PRRS world. Would you mind sharing with the audience just a few key points that you'd like for them to take away from today's conversation?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing, I think, for me is I think about the daily pig care, independent of the disease. And I know we didn't really have much chance to talk about it, but this identifying the pig, and I think it even extends into the sow farm as well, is just identifying as we approach sow mortality. There's been some work we've been working on. You've got to identify these animals quickly, and kind of the neat thing about sows is, in gestation, stalls, we got the ability to see their daily feed intake, right? So that's kind of a neat indicator to say, if that sow's not eating, there's a reason why she's not eating, right? So but I think, and we're seeing some mortality reductions in some farms that are putting attention and focus in that area. So it really just tells me, yeah, we're going to have these diseases, we're going to keep working on them with vaccines and therapeutics, hopefully, and technology. But in the interim, I think the challenge really is we just got to make sure we're in there with the caretakers and teaching them, look for those pigs that aren't up. They're not up walking around, not in there eating. They're the ones laying in the corner. If that sow's not getting up to eat, that ought to make you take a second look at her. And I really think it's about, when in doubt, treat. If she's not looking quite right, or if that pig's not looking right, there's probably a reason for that. Trust your gut a little bit with that. So, because I really think there's a lot of this, between whether it's a growing pig or the sow, that they're giving you cues. You just gotta, we've got to make sure we're working with training our people to kind of hone in on those cues. And if we're in there, giving them the attention and treatment and care as prescribed from our veterinarian on our treatment protocols, you'll see improvements in mortality from that. So I really think early identification and treatment is the key. I think we get so wrapped up in what we're treating with or what vaccine, we get so wrapped up in that that we kind of forget about the basics. It's we got to make sure we're in there looking at them and we're evaluating them. And if there's something doesn't feel right about it, make sure we're giving them care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. Trust your gut, for sure. For sure. Well, as we wrap up our time, Chris, we like to ask our guest speakers just a couple of questions. The first question we like to ask is, do you have a favorite swine resource that you'd recommend to the group?
Well, I would kid my nutrition friends if I knew a good nutrition book, I'd throw that one out. But since I don't know a good one, I'll have to resort to my old standby has always been Diseases of Swine. That was back in my days early on. Laptop computers were just kind of the thing, and I remember getting a CD of Diseases of Swine. So I would have my laptop and my CD of Diseases of Swine. If there was something I wasn't sure on, I'd go out in my car and take a look at it. So. Yep, I still that's probably still my favorite swine resource of today. I mean, it's obviously written for veterinarians, but there's just a lot of great information in there for everybody. So that's kind of my go-to on that for sure.
Absolutely. How about something that's not related to pigs? Is there a book that you would recommend to the audience?
I would tell you, if you're thinking about from a personal development standpoint, one that I had the opportunity to be involved in a leadership academy I thought was really good was the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think just from a personal organization, understanding yourself, understanding others, how to get the most out of yourself. I would say the 7 Habits, there's quite a few things from there that I've kind of taken and implemented. I think in various points throughout my life that have kind of stuck with me, so much so we kind of went through that and, had the old planner, the organizer, the Covey planner and organizer, but, now I've kind of adapted that to a computerized model. But there are things I think I adapted from that book that I was able to utilize and put into a computerized model. But yeah, I would say from that standpoint, that was probably, I'm not a huge reader. So that was probably one that I did certainly one that was really good, I thought, for me and kind of helped me along my personal journey.
Absolutely. That is a good book. So the last question I have for you focuses around envisioning someone in your mind that you identify as being successful, and what characteristic or trait about them stands out to you that you think has allowed them to be successful?
Yeah, I would say it was probably my last boss, to be honest with you, Steve Pullman, which is my vet friends would find hilarious because he's a nutritionist, right? But Steve was just fantastic because he was really always invested in his people, right? And most people who have ever seen Steve speak up and challenge speakers at a meeting wouldn't guess that. But Steve was actually some interactions I had him on an industry event was part of the reason I went to work for him, right? And he was really good about, he's obviously very organized, and there's a lot of things I learned from him, just in terms of he would sit down on a Sunday evening and have a planning meeting with himself, right? So he would plan out his week, and use his organizer and make sure he had everything set up for the week. So I try to do some of that. He was really good about having goal reviews with his people, quarterly goal reviews. And I think that's important because I don't think if you don't do that, there's tangible things that happen on there about holding people accountable. And you always go back and look at what was your last quarter? What'd you put on your goal review? How successful were you? What things that you want to get done for the next quarter? But, there was always a section on, what's some of your personal goals too, because you sit there and think if you don't have that organized interaction, how often would you really sit down and think about that, even as from an employee standpoint? So, I think that's a good emotional, deposit to make with your employees. So I would say to those of you who manage people, that's something you really ought to think about. I thought that was highly effective in motivating your people. And really just show them that you care and some things like that. And I think for me, one thing that I learned too was in my current position, because, I work across a lot of different departments and get to interact with a lot of people and I get involved in a lot of stuff. I'm a person that doesn't say no very easily, so I can get involved in a lot of stuff. For me, it's kind of the meeting creates the action, right? So I tend to use my Outlook calendar, and I've got I have all these things piled up, but if I schedule a meeting, then that goes to the top of the priority list, right? So it's always important for me to kind of schedule meetings with people to kind of sometimes keep things moving along. So that was another thing that I learned from Steve, was that the meeting creates the action. So it was always important to make sure you have those milestone meetings to keep the ball moving on certain projects.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's certainly a quote I've heard him say before too, is meeting creates the action, for sure.
Yep.
Well, wonderful, Chris. We do want to thank you for your time today. It was very informational, and certainly gave us some things to think about in terms of disease and how to start pigs, and identifying pigs that need a little bit more attention than others. And so again, I do want to thank you for your time today. We greatly appreciate it. And for our audience today, just a reminder, this is Dr. Chris Rademacher, who is a clinical veterinarian at the Iowa State University's College of Veterinary Medicine. Chris, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. It's my pleasure.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.